Hey everybody. When I taught this course last, I used the textbooks that had already been chosen by the person who was scheduled to teach before me, because I was tapped to teach the course very late in the summer, and it was a fall course then. And so I've changed the books for this term because I didn't really like the books I was teaching from. But I wanted to share this PowerPoint. I revised it a little bit and re-record it because one of the books was called Teaching Literature in High School by Thomas McCann and John Knapp. And it's not a required book this time. I thought it was a bit dry and overly theoretical. It's also not even available in the library or anything. But if you ever want to build your professional library and get additional insights, it might be an interesting book to choose. It's not a bad book. It just isn't for me a good book to use as a textbook for a course like this. I think I like the Burke book better. But the nice thing it does do is that the entire book is focused on literally teaching literature in high school. That is the title of the book, and it is 150 or so pages about that. And I think some of the ideas and some of the theory behind it are still important for you to be aware of. And one is various theories of literature that I'm sure you've talked about in your English courses. And from a high school perspective, the most important theories in recent memory are those of new criticism and reader response. And those are, again, probably things you are familiar with. New criticism is a more formulaic theory where you are really looking at the elements of literature like character and plot and setting, and it often resulted in formulaic responses. There were often in the new criticism, there is one right response to many questions. Somewhat in reaction to that reader response theory, which really emerges in the 1970s and 80s, thanks to, among others, Louise Rosenblatt, um, is really about the internal response that a reader has to literature. And quite differently than new criticism, essentially any response can be valid. Now, the problems with that is that if every response is valid, is there any valid response? Like if everything is right, then what's the point? And so your authors argue in favor of a newer theory called social minds or distributed cognition, which is, they might say it's a middle ground. I don't think it really necessarily is, but it is a newer theory that really focuses largely on the social and emotional resonances that literature engenders in its readers. How do people respond? How does the reader respond, which I know is reader response, but it's also how do their classmates respond? It is sometimes called distributed cognition. You can probably find more about it if you Google or look on the library databases. I am unconvinced that is the best theory of literature to use, but maybe it is. One thing that is important, I think, and this was brought up in that textbook, I'm pretty sure it's brought up in most textbooks that I want to just remind you of, is the importance of the zone of proximal development and Lev Vygotsky. In the spirit of full transparency, I am not a constructivist, but I do agree with Vygotsky about the ZPD, the zone of proximal development. I recently heard this described or reheard this described as the Goldilocks zone. It is something that is not too hard, it is not too easy, it is just right. And when we consider the challenges of the literature we are asking our students to read, we want to consider the zone of proximal development in terms of, is this text too hard, too easy, or just right? And teachers have done this for generations without using that terminology. And we've talked about this a lot in education through the years when we talk about things like an independent reading level versus an instructional reading level versus a frustration reading level. So something at a frustration reading level is too frustrating for a reader. Something that's at the independent reading level is something that students can read on their own without instructional support. And something that is instructional is for the purposes of instruction in that Goldilocks zone. It is something that is challenging to the reader, but that they can read with support from a teacher. For example, when I taught high school, one of the books I taught was The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. And frankly, I chose it because one of my colleagues, who I did not like and disagreed with philosophically, harumphed regularly that kids these days were getting dumber, particularly our students, because of demographic shifts. Although she didn't say it in those terms, that's what she implied. And that she had taught this book for years and they couldn't understand it anymore. And I took that as a challenge and I taught it. And it was definitely not something they could read on their own. It was not at their independent reading level. It was very much at the instructional reading level. And it was probably it probably was borderline frustration for some students. And so when I taught that book, I had to provide lots of support, not in terms of students' ability to sound out the words or anything like that, like they could understand that, but just because the setting of that book is so foreign now in the 21st century that it was very foreign to students. But the themes of that book, on the other hand, were actually very relevant to students in that high school, but I had to help them recognize that, and that's where the instructional part comes in. Now, zone of proximal development does not mean that you should not keep the interests of your students in mind as you're choosing literature either to assign, either as options, or even for your classroom library. You should think about what your students are interested in, what is going to hold their interest. That's important. It is, of course, important throughout our instruction to build students' background knowledge and also to activate the background knowledge they have. Or from a cognitive psychology standpoint, and I am a cognitivist, again, full disclosure, to activate students' schema. And we do this through pre-reading activities. We do this through making connections between what students are reading and other things they may have read, or maybe it's things that they have seen on TV or in movies or online. And if we're teaching a novel, part of it is connecting it to things that have happened before in the novel, so we get that that flow going. As we help students construct meaning, and again, not a constructivist, it is important to model. If we want students to engage in a certain comprehension strategy, it's important for us to model that strategy. And it's also important for us to engage in careful questioning with students about their understanding of the text, as well as to help students develop the abilities to question themselves. And that can involve questioning in small group work. It can involve self-questioning skills, but students aren't going to learn to carefully question unless they see that modeled by us, their teachers. An interesting idea that I think is probably accurate in that textbook that I'm talking about is called Rules of Configuration. And a better way to describe it is actually the patterns of literature. And I think this comes into being with the one of your other books you're reading. You are reading this semester, Just Read It. I think it's important for students to read widely as well as deeply. And we have at times recently, we've really started to emphasize close reading. I think close reading is a really important skill, but we're overemphasizing it. We are having students closely read so much that they no longer have time to read widely, much less to read for entertainment, which is another thing we need to do. Reading widely helps students recognize how literature is configured. And by configured, we aren't just talking about the plot, although we are. We're talking about how that plot is presented to the reader. In other words, from an analysis, from your informal analysis of the first couple chapters of the book, how do you think it's going to turn out? And that's how literature is configured. And in some works, it is a very sort of clear movement from the beginning to the end. In others, there's a clear movement with lots of obstacles in the way. And in still others, what we think is going to be the ending, the author tricks us and gives us an ending we aren't expecting, which, if it's not done skillfully, is not a good thing. But if it's done skillfully, is. So different configurations or patterns of literature, these are things that really can't be taught explicitly. And there's lots of research that supports direct instruction. Direct explicit instruction is highly effective, especially for students with disabilities, especially for English learners. But there are some things that don't lend themselves to direct instruction. And this is arguably one of them, that this comes from wide reading and discussion. Different works of literature have critiques about them. I took a course, an English course, a couple of semesters ago that, as many English courses do, really focused on this, where we would read something and then we would go out and find different critical interpretations of it. You know, a Marxist interpretation, a formalist interpretation, or using our terminology here, maybe a new critical interpretation or a reader response interpretation. Different critics have different views about a certain piece of literature. That's true for young adult literature as well as classic literature. For me, that idea really supports the idea that a work can have multiple themes. I think it's okay if your students come up with multiple themes from a single work, as long as they can support those themes and as long as their support is valid. Um, right? You can't build a theme on one single passage in one paragraph on page 243 of a 300-page book. Like that's too narrow. But many works of literature can, I think, um, lend themselves to different themes, even to competing themes. One thing that's important is being able to discuss literature. I am a huge fan of Socratic Seminar. I do recognize its limitations. When I taught AP language, I had classes of 36 usually, and in a very small, cramped classroom, and I could not do Socratic Seminar well in that environment. I couldn't. I did it much better when I had 20 or 25 in a class than when I had 36 in a class. I fully admit that. Now, again, and part of that was just the physical layout of the room. If I had a little more space to work with, I could have done it better. Ideally, I would have been enough space to have more than one group discussing. There are different models of Socratic Seminar, and of course, it comes from the Socratic method, which is where, according to Plato, Socrates never answered a direct question in his life. He only responded to a question with another question, which can be beneficial. It was in Socrates' case, arguably, but it's also very annoying for students. I would recommend you not do that always. Um, but this idea of a Socratic seminar, it's sometimes called inside-outside circles or other things. Discussion over a text with open-ended questions. They are not right there questions. They are questions that require opinion, interpretation, inference, and should involve support from the text. The teacher is not part of the discussion themselves. The teacher remains outside the discussion. And so the actual creation of the group consists of an inner circle of chairs, usually. And so my PowerPoint, whenever I draw on it, it has artifacts, and I don't know why. I don't know if it's a PowerPoint issue or if it's a Carl issue, but it happens across computers and across PowerPoint versions. So here's my inner circle. Pretend this is a circle. Ignore those line segments coming out of it. This inner circle is where the students who are discussing are sitting. And I would typically have, depending on the size of my class, 6 to 8 students probably in the inner circle. And then the other students would sit outside that inner circle in a larger circle. Again, ignore the horizontal lines. Outside of it. And that would be the rest of the class. I, too, would be sitting outside of the circle. Like there's me and my X. And I'm going to put another X inside the circle. And I'm going to circle it. So, I, outside of the circle, pose a question. It's open-ended. It's higher level. It is the job of the inner circle to discuss that question. Now, ideally, my question is one that lends itself to discussion, including debate, that not everyone agrees about it. And I've taught my students to do things like, well, I noticed that in paragraph, let's say we're doing it over a short story. I noticed in the first paragraph on page 2 that blah, blah, blah. And then we teach students how to agree and disagree with each other in ways that move the discussion forward. I agree with what Leroy said. Another example is blah, blah, blah. Or someone might say, I disagree with what Leroy said, because look at this counterexample in paragraph 7. Or someone might say, I don't fully agree with what Leroy said because of X, but I think he has a good point because of Y. I have sorry, I developed open-ended questions. I also have follow-up questions for them. So if I think something is open-ended, but they just sort of come to a halt, I can prompt them to maybe go in a different direction. But I always want to over prepare for like a 15-minute discussion or a 20-minute discussion. Eventually, I want to get my students to the point where they are coming up with the questions themselves. And I usually was able to do so. Um, this circled X is the hot seat. So people in the outer circle are not allowed to speak during the discussion. But if there was something that they just had to say, if there was a question that they desperately wanted to answer or to chime in on or to whatever, they could, if no one was sitting in the hot seat, they would get up, they would sit in the hot seat, they would say their piece. They might answer a question if one were posed to them in the hot seat, and then they would return to the outer circle. What did students do in the outer circle? I made my students, so we used a program called AVID, Advancement via Individual Determination, which I may talk more about, which is a great program when it's run correctly, and is just pointless busy work when it's not run correctly. And AVID, among other things, does different learning and teaching strategies to help students succeed in challenging classes, essentially. And one of them is Socratic Seminar. One of the other things is Cornell note-taking, a very specific note-taking format that you may very well have been introduced to already, so I'm not going to go into it. I would make students in the outside circle take Cornell notes over the discussion. Another approach that I have seen in articles and books that talk about Socratic Seminar or inside outside circles is to have the outer circle, each person in the outer circle is sort of paired up with a person in the inner circle and they evaluate them. I never did that because I felt that was just a way for bad things to happen. I was never comfortable for the most part of putting students in that sort of evaluative role. And that is my own personal views, and if you disagree with that, I think that's fine. It wasn't for it didn't really connect to my philosophies of education. Um so for me, having them take Cornell notes was beneficial for a couple of reasons. One was that it encouraged students to want to be in the inner circle because students really didn't enjoy taking Cornell notes. And so they would rather talk than write in this particular case. And so it was encouraging for more people to want to be in the inner circle. I would also switch this up. So, for example, maybe I would do, Socratic Seminar for much of my class period. And I should add, when I taught, my classes were all in block format. So when I taught middle school, language arts classes were what the school called double blocked, which meant they were 90 minutes a day every day. When I taught high school, they were in the traditional block, which meant they were 90 minutes a day for every other day. And so I had a significant chunk of time to use. And so I would often have more than one Socratic seminar, and I would switch students up. So people would be in the inner circle, and then they would move to the outer circle, and vice versa. Um, I also will say that I had students who really wanted to be in the inner circle, and they were super smart, and they could talk in the inner circle without actually having read the assignment. Like they just wanted to participate. It wasn't that they didn't want to take notes. It was like they wanted to hear themselves talk. And so what I also started doing, and I had to do this in a smaller class where I could do this quickly, I would give a pretest over the reading, and you had to pass the pretest to be eligible to be in the inner circle. I often used as a homework assignment over the reading. I would move to your homework over the reading is to come up with a higher level question, a question you want students to discuss in Socratic Seminar. And I would collect those at the start of the day, and I had my own questions that sort of as backups, but I would collect those and I would use those as well. And again, with practice, students got better at asking those open-ended questions. There's all sorts of different approaches to use on how to develop readers. Um, we'll talk more about that when we talk about teaching reading in a couple of weeks. I don't think there's one best approach personally. I think good teachers have developed readers using different approaches for a very long time. Um, I do know that, as I mentioned earlier, the research supporting direct instruction is very clear. And sometimes that goes contrary to what you sometimes are taught in education programs where we don't like direct instruction because we think it's not engaging or we think it's not student centered. But in reality, direct instruction is very engaging because people are more engaged when they're learning than when they're not learning. And part of being student centered is helping students learn materials in ways that work for them. And direct instruction does that. The research is actually really, really clear. It is one of the most effective things that can be done in a school. And so direct explicit instruction is important. It is also important, I think, for students to have opportunities to read widely, as I mentioned, including self-selected reading, which is one reason why I'm having you read Just Read It, because I think that's really important. I think you need to advocate for it as professional educators because it is easy for it to get sort of kicked to the curb um, in exchange for some new program that probably isn't going to work. What I like to think about with this is that it doesn't matter what skill, like if a student is a beautifully, wonderfully skilled reader but never actually reads, then what's the point? And I understand there's a point, oh, you need to read to do forms and to do taxes and to, sign your contract at work or whatever. And yes, that's all relevant, but frankly, if that is all we are doing it for, we may as well just sign the world over to AI right now and have it read to us. If we are not having students read, including self-selected reading, we do them a disservice, in my opinion. And again, you're free to disagree and find evidence to refute me. I think it's a balance. I think direct instruction has a place, but I think there also has to be a place for self-selected independent reading. And again, when I taught, I did not have students self-select independently read all the time, and I wouldn't if I went back into the classroom tomorrow. It was a variety. Like students read things that I told them to read. There were times when we all read the same novel. Like we usually all read the same novel, or we read the same thing in the textbook usually. But students also had the opportunity regularly during each week to engage in self-selected reading, and they had a requirement um, to engage in it, to have read so many books or so many pages or so many whatever over a certain period. You can go too far with that. Things like book reports aren't aren't helpful, as they weren't helpful in the 90s or before. They certainly aren't helpful now, where ChatGPT can write a book report for you. Um, but having some sort of accountability just in terms of a discussion of the book with a peer or something else is important, or some sort of just a checklist that, yeah, I've been reading. And that sort of relates to my final thoughts. Originally, when I first recorded this video, the final thoughts were strengths and weaknesses of the book. Um, which again has both, I think. Like I just opened it like randomly and it was like, oh look, reading with accountability, which is kind of just literally just what I said. So there's certainly good points in here. Um, and here I just want you to think about strengths and weaknesses of what you have seen regarding teaching literature in classrooms. That might be in your college experiences, and I know a college classroom is different than a high school classroom, and certainly than a middle school classroom. It could be in your field experiences. It could be from your own experiences in high school or middle school. What approaches do you think work best and why? Which ones do you think don't work well and why? And do you think certain approaches might vary for certain learners?